In the summer of 1907, Dublin Castle became the center of a mystery that still fascinates historians. The Irish crown jewels, a set of jeweled regalia belonging to the Order of St. Patrick, vanished from a secure safe within the castle walls. The theft was discovered just days before a planned royal visit, causing a scandal that shook the British administration in Ireland. On the morning of July 6, 1907, a cleaning woman arrived for her routine duties at Bedford Tower in Dublin Castle and found something amiss. The door to the strong room where the jewels safe was kept stood wide open, with a key still dangling in the lock. The inner security door was bolted, so at first nothing seemed obviously stolen. Sir Arthur Vickers, the official custodian of the jewels, was initially unconcerned and went about his day. It was only later that afternoon, when a messenger was sent to store a knight's ceremonial collar in the safe, that the grim truth was revealed. The safe had been emptied and the Irish crown jewels were gone. The alarm spread quickly. The jewels had disappeared just 4 days before King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra were due in Dublin for a state visit. A special investiture ceremony was to take place at the Irish International Exhibition, where the king planned to use the jewels to induct a new member of the Order of St. Patrick. With the regalia missing, the ceremony had to be cancelled. King Edward was reportedly furious about the theft, and the incident proved to be a major embarrassment for the Irish authorities. The Dublin Metropolitan Police launched an immediate investigation, and even a detective from London's Scotland Yard, Chief Inspector John Kane, was called in to assist. Investigators found no signs of forced entry on the doors or the safe, indicating that whoever stole the jewels had used the actual keys or precise copies. From the very start, suspicion focused on an inside job. Evidence from the crime scene reinforced the idea that the thief was someone with intimate access and patience. Inside the safe, the perpetrators had shown meticulous care. For example, a sky blue ribbon that had been attached to one of the jeweled badges was carefully unscrewed and left behind in its box. This is a task that would have taken several minutes, and the authorities speculated an outsider would have ripped it off in a hurry. Likewise, the tissue and cloth in the storage boxes were neatly refolded after the jewels were removed. This was no smash-and-grab robbery. It appeared the thief had ample time and no fear of interruption. The careful method of the theft, combined with the lack of forced entry, made it clear the culprit likely had authorized access to keys and inside knowledge of the castle's security routines. As the investigation unfolded, attention turned to those who had custody or access to the safe. The foremost figure was Sir Arthur Vickers, Ulster King of Arms, whose prestigious office included the duty of guarding the jeweled insignia. Vickers was responsible for the keys. He usually kept one of the two safe keys on his person and stored the other at his home in a locked drawer. In the wake of the theft, Vickers became one of the first suspects, simply due to his role and a series of security lapses on his watch. It emerged that Vickers had been alarmingly lax in safeguarding the jewels. On one occasion, he had drunkenly allowed friends to handle the keys, even waking up after a party to find himself draped in the priceless jewels as a prank. Personally, I speculate that this may have been a dry run for the jewel heist, and also perhaps one of the world's first documented uses of the "it's just a prank bro" excuse. But this wasn't the only negligent thing Vickers had done. Far from it. Just weeks before the heist, he had mistakenly left the safe's key on a key ring with other office keys, which one of the servants then found and returned. Such stories cast Vickers as a negligent buffoon at best. Vickers, however, vehemently denied any involvement in the theft. He insisted he was being made a scapegoat and maintained his innocence to his dying day. Despite the lack of hard evidence tying him to the crime, Vickers faced severe consequences, and King Edward demanded his resignation. A secretive vice-regal commission later found Vickers guilty of negligence in his duties, but stopped short of finding that he was in on it. This effectively ended his career and tarnished his reputation. Another figure under scrutiny was Pierce Mahoney, an Office of Arms employee who was Vickers' nephew and assistant. Mahoney had access to the Office of Arms and was familiar with the castle's operations. He was questioned as a possible accomplice or culprit. However, most contemporaries and later historians believe Mahoney was innocent. He had no clear motive to steal the jewels and was known to be loyal to Vickers. Suspicion soon concentrated on Francis Shackleton, a charismatic man who was Vickers' second-in-command at Dublin Castle. Francis Shackleton was the younger brother of the famous Antarctic explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, which gave the case an added dose of public intrigue. Unlike his explorer brother, Francis sought his fortunes in high society circles. And let's just say that Shackleton was known to get around these circles and was particularly interested in becoming very closely acquainted with wealthy and powerful men. Vickers had appointed Shackleton to the honorary position of Dublin Herald in the Office of Arms in 1905, which, while unpaid, gave him status and access to Dublin Castle. Shackleton was often a house guest of Vickers, even sharing Vickers' residence during stays in Dublin. This close relationship meant Shackleton could potentially get hold of Vickers' keys without raising suspicion. Moreover, investigators uncovered that Shackleton was in dire financial straits by 1907. He had been involved in speculative ventures that failed, and his debts were mounting, a strong possible motive for a theft of valuable jewels. All these factors made Francis Shackleton a prime suspect in the eyes of many. Indeed, Vickers himself later accused Shackleton of betrayal, and numerous people at the time believed Shackleton was the true culprit behind the heist. One theory, reported years later, suggested that Shackleton, together with his close friend Captain Richard Gorges, had capitalized on Vickers' lax security. According to this account, one night after Vickers had drunk himself into a stupor, Shackleton and Gorges supposedly lifted the keys from the sleeping Vickers. They entered the library safe, removed the jewels, then returned everything, keys and doors, to normal, so no immediate suspicion would arise. This clever ruse would mean the theft wasn't discovered until weeks later, giving the thieves a long head start. However, despite these suspicions and rumors, Francis Shackleton was never formally charged. In the official investigation, he maintained an alibi. Conveniently, he had left Ireland for London on June 11, 1907, and did not return until after the jewels were reported missing. This alibi didn't entirely clear him for two simple reasons. It's never been entirely clear when the Irish crown jewels were actually stolen, and he may have had an accomplice such as Gorges do the deed. Some have speculated that investigators were reluctant to prosecute Shackleton for fear he might expose scandalous information about others in high society if cornered. Francis Shackleton was known to get around high society circles, and let's just say a lot of influential men may not like what he had to say about their late-night activities. Shackleton's later life did little to dispel doubts about his character. A few years after the jewel affair, he was convicted of fraud for unrelated financial crimes in 1913 and spent time in prison. He had even fled the UK to Portuguese East Africa for a time, where he attempted to work in the colonial administration and later found work on a plantation. Upon release, he changed his name and lived quietly abroad, dying in obscurity many years later, having never admitted any role in the Dublin Castle heist. A final suspect emerged long after the initial investigation: Francis Bennett Goldney. Goldney was an Englishman who had been appointed to a minor post at Dublin Castle just months before the jewels vanished. At the time of the theft, Goldney attracted little suspicion as he was seen as a wealthy, respectable gentleman with no obvious motive. And yes, you heard me correctly, he wasn't investigated because he was already seen as rich enough. as if being wealthy had ever stopped someone from accumulating more wealth. It was only in 1918, when Goldney died in a car accident in France, that his reputation darkened. After his death, authorities discovered a trove of stolen historical items hidden in his home, revealing that Goldney had been secretly stealing valuable artifacts. This shocking discovery led some to retroactively suspect Goldney in the Irish crown jewels case. If he was willing to steal manuscripts and artworks, perhaps he also stole the jewels. Investigators never found any direct evidence linking Goldney to the 1907 heist, but his later infamy as a thief added another tantalizing theory to the saga. Notably, some have suggested that there was a curse on the Irish crown jewels. Vickers was executed in 1921 during the Irish War of Independence on suspicion that he was a British sympathizer. Francis Shackleton's life spiraled down after 1907. By 1910, he was bankrupt, and in the years that followed, he was convicted for multiple fraudulent schemes, including swindling a longtime friend out of a fortune. Despite being from a wealthy and famous family, he died in relative poverty, living under an assumed name. Captain Richard Gorges, who had been whispered about as Shackleton's accomplice, likewise led a troubled life. He was involved in a violent incident with the police in which he ended up slaying an officer. Due to some complicating circumstances, he was only sentenced to 12 years in prison. While in prison, Gorges allegedly tried to bargain for leniency by offering information about the crown jewels, but authorities did not deem his claims credible. Gorges was later prosecuted for minor offenses, including shoplifting and passing bad checks. In 1944, he was struck by a train in London, ending the tale of Captain Richard Gorges once and for all. Potentially for reasons of propriety and saving face for a wealthy family of the landed gentry, his death seems to have been ruled accidental, but you can apply your own judgment. Pierce Mahoney, Vickers' loyal assistant, withdrew from public life in 1914. He was found dead by an accidental shot in a boating incident, a mysterious end that some have wondered about. As for Francis Bennett Goldney, he continued a respectable public career, even becoming a member of Parliament, until his car accident in 1918. Despite intensive investigations and worldwide attention, the Irish crown jewels have never been recovered. Notably, the jewels weren't inherently incredibly valuable at the time. It was their status as the Irish crown jewels and the historical value of the jewels that made them just so priceless. Modern theorists speculate that for this reason, it's unlikely that the goods were broken up, anonymized, and sold separately. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to share this video with your friends and on your socials. Also make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you're always notified whenever I drop new content. Also, if you didn't know, I have another channel, Lazy Chill Zone, where I have hundreds of hours of content covering all sorts of mysteries. The Iron Maiden is one of the most infamous torture devices linked with the medieval period. It's typically described as a man-sized iron cabinet or coffin lined with sharp spikes on the inside, into which a victim would be placed. Once the doors of the sarcophagus-like device closed, the spikes would pierce the victim's body in multiple places, causing severe pain and a slow death by bleeding. This gruesome image of medieval cruelty has appeared in countless books, museums, and even horror films. However, the historical reality of the Iron Maiden is far more complicated, and many scholars question whether such a device was ever actually used in the Middle Ages at all. Curiously, there are no known medieval records that describe an Iron Maiden device in use. The concept of locking a person in a spiked coffin seems to have pre-medieval origins in legend and literature. Historians have traced early accounts of similar devices in various cultures long before the Middle Ages. Early Christian writers like Tertullian and Augustine recount the torture of Roman general Marcus Attilius Regulus. In this story, Regulus was confined in a tight wooden box studded with sharp nails on all sides, so that he couldn't lean without being pierced. He ultimately died from being unable to sleep, rather than from the spikes directly. This tale, though ancient, contains the key elements of an Iron Maiden and may have inspired later imaginations. Another example appears in the Arab world in the 9th century. The Abbasid vizier Ibn al-Zayyat was said to have constructed a wooden chest lined with iron spikes to drop some seriously inhumane abuse on prisoners. Ironically, this cruel invention was reportedly used on Ibn al-Zayyat himself when he fell out of favor in 847, leading to his death inside his own spiked box. This suggests that the story of the spiked chest may have been added to the story later to enhance the moral tale of the story. These early anecdotes suggest that the concept of an Iron Maiden-like torture device has floated around for centuries. None of these, however, were called Iron Maiden, nor is there evidence that a dedicated iron cabinet with interior spikes was actually built in those times. Some historians also point to a medieval German device called the Schandmantel as a possible inspiration. The Schandmantel was essentially a barrel or coat made of wood or metal, used to punish and publicly shame offenders, but it did not contain spikes. 19th century showmen or writers may have misinterpreted or embellished such artifacts by adding spikes in their descriptions or reconstructions. Despite the lack of medieval evidence, the Iron Maiden became firmly embedded in popular imagination as a quintessential medieval torture device. The turning point for this legend seems to have come in the late 18th century. In 1793, a German philosopher and antiquarian named Johann Philipp Siebenkees published an account of an execution supposedly carried out in Nuremberg in 1515. According to his story, a criminal met his fate inside an Iron Maiden, allegedly due to his participation in coin-forging activities. However, modern historians have strong reasons to believe Siebenkees simply fabricated the story as a sensational anecdote. No earlier records corroborate the 1515 execution, and it appears Siebenkees' report was the first time anyone had described such a device being used in medieval Europe. Before I get the comments, I realize 1515 is the early modern period by most modern historiographical standards. That said, the late medieval period is generally agreed to have ended around 1500, so Siebenkees wasn't far off. In the early 1800s, several museums and private collections in Europe started displaying Iron Maiden contraptions, claiming they were relics of medieval torture chambers. The most famous example was the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, which was exhibited as a genuine medieval instrument of pain. Sources indicate that the Nuremberg Iron Maiden was actually constructed around the turn of the 19th century, possibly around 1800 to 1802, specifically for display. It featured a cast iron exterior crafted in a pseudo-Gothic style, often with a female face or religious motifs, and interior spikes that would line up with a victim's vital organs. This artifact gained enormous notoriety and it toured exhibitions and world's fairs, horrifying and fascinating the public with the idea of medieval barbarity. In reality, it was a product of modern craftsmen and imagination, not a surviving medieval object. The original Nuremberg Iron Maiden was destroyed in 1944 when Allied bombing raids struck the city during World War II, but you can see the copy on your screen right now. Today, the consensus in scholarly circles is that the Iron Maiden's medieval existence is a myth. In other words, it was effectively written into history in the 18th and 19th centuries, not the Middle Ages. Some scholars have noted that there was a trend in the 19th century to cobble together various antiques into claimed medieval torture devices. This practice was part of a broader Victorian-era fascination with the dark reality preceding their time, and with the Middle Ages. Oh, and before I end this segment, I have to mention that there's an actual legitimate account of the Iron Maiden being used for its supposed intended purpose. But it's not a medieval usage, and in fact comes from the late 20th and early 21st century. We can all agree that Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, right? Well, let's just say that he was an absolute saint compared to his psychopathic son, Uday Hussein, a man who saw the Iron Maiden and thought, yeah, that sounds like good dinner entertainment.